Lecture is in memory of Rudolf Hilferding, Australian-born German politician who was a leading representative of the Viennese development of Marxism and who served as finance minister in 1923 and 1928 in two German Social Democratic Party-led governments. This lecture is titled Karl Marx's Prescient Theory of Centralization of Capital, Crisis, and an Africentric Response, and will be delivered by Cynthia Hewitt, Associate Professor, Morehouse College at Atlanta, Georgia. This lecture will be chaired by Jean-Joseph Boillot. May I request the speaker and the chair to please come on stage. Professor Jean-Joseph Boillot has a PhD in economics and social sciences. He has taught at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure and spent many years in Asia for his research on India's development model compared to China, and then as economic advisor for the French Treasury. Professor, may I please request you to take over the proceedings?
No green light, but it works, no? That's the most important. Yeah, light has come. Thank you, everybody. I know that morning is not so easy after a long day like yesterday, but today will be even more painful. Temperature outside would be hopefully 45 maybe today, no? So schools are closed, hotel is closed, you better stay with us. Now, I'm very happy to share that session. I don't know, by accident it happened that Cynthia and me will talk not on Africa only, but at least we will introduce Africa today on the scene, and that's important, especially she will talk on Nkrumah. I know I was very happy to meet when I was young. Yeah, he died now and passed away, but what a fascinating leader he was. And unfortunately, my dear friend from Senegal, Dakar, could not come, get their visa. You know that India is a country of chaotic decision-making processes, and if you apply for conference visa, you're sure of at least that you will never get it. So, and we made the mistake not to tell them to go through that very smart and digital decision process. But anyway, so instead of cancelling the session, the organizer asked me to read and to present the paper of Sharif. So I'll do, and I'm very sorry for my French accent for you and with you till at least 11 o'clock, but I'm sure you will appreciate Cynthia. Speech. And we start with Cynthia. I'm supposed to present at length, but you have the presentation. Just to say that she is the founder of the International Comparative Labor Studies and Associate Professor of Sociology and faculty at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. There are many Atlanta in the world, no, it's true. She grew up in Harlem, Bronx, New York. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's always something you always remember in your life. And she grew up in Harlem and was shaped by the freedom and black power movement, including the All African People's Revolutionary Party, with Kwame Ture as a leader. The American name is Stokely Carmichael, is it? Yes. Yeah. Area of specialization is political economy, or the world system, race, class, gender inequality, then sustainable development and environmental sociology. Published research includes analysis of wealth, ownership, and power base of racial and ethnic inequality. So, better we go quickly directly to your speech, which title is Karl Marx, Prescient Theory of Centralization of Capital, Crisis, and an Encrumaist Analysis. I knew about Marxist. That's the first time that I read Encrumaist. It's not easy to pronounce, but it's not so difficult. Encrumaist. Okay, so this, I'm really the pleasure to introduce that Encrumaist lecture to Patna participants. Please, Cynthia, floor is yours. And enjoy your morning. Please, applaud. And if you don't mind, I ask Cynthia to skip the PowerPoint so she can talk slowly. You can get the message, and you will get immediately the paper. Yeah, Cynthia? We will do so that
yes, we'll
we will get the paper very soon on the internet. We'll let you know by the end of the midday how to get the full paper, because it's 27, almost 30 pages, and I suggest that she shorten a little bit this speech so that you get the glimpse of the core message. Is my English correct, Lord McDye? Please, Cynthia.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here today, and when I heard that this conference was being held, I was thrilled that I was able to join the group, because I can't think of anything better to do than to talk about Marx and about revolution. Yes, it's so rare. I had intended to spend more time on Nkrumah, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him up front. So what I want to do, I think, is just to introduce the topic and tell you a little bit about the findings, because the findings led me to focus on China. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean when I say an Nkrumahist analysis. So I'm going to assume a pretty high level of knowledge of Marx and try to just move along. Okay. Karl Marx analyzed capitalism as a progressive system of social relationships with the potential for organizing ever more material forces into production, and that once set into motion, it must be continuous and expanding in nature, and thus would come to spread its tendrils and enact its destructive, productive relations everywhere around the globe. However, he also argued that the sheer force of productivity which would develop would outstrip the social relations which made possible the distribution and consumption of the output, leading to the collapse of the market system and eventual and inevitable revolutionary emergence of new relationships. It is a system with fatal internal contradictions. A key driver in this is the centralization of capital, the progressive development of control over the accumulation of wealth of everyone and in everything by a diminishing number of individual capitalists, representatives of the capital relationship. So I present some evidence for looking at the question, how close have we come to this end game? How close have we come to full incorporation of every area and every people into the capitalist world system scenario of Marx's analysis? So focusing on the concept of centralization, I look at some of the contemporary data on global capital and incorporation of people into the system. In particular, I took a look at the IMF survey called the Financial Access Survey, FAS. And then I also looked at some of the other measures of the emergence of a unified system, which I will go ahead and talk about. We look at the extent to which it can be argued that all people have come into a relationship with capital by comparing the density of engagement with the money systems, meeting the majority or substantial, significant, critical aspects of their consumption needs through mediation of money and markets, Based on the reported level of financial access found in fully proletarianized nations, we compared the degree to which people outside of the Eurocentric core are also incorporated, i.e., have been made to rely on monetized lifestyles. Theoretically, only at the point where centralization of capital has reached a slowdown to a global completion is it possible to see if Marx is wrong or right about what will occur next. So a lot of my thought and work here revolves around the idea of the realization crisis. If a given amount of labor produces more products more cheaply, when they are sold in the market, the capitalist must sell more of them in order to obtain the same or more mass of surplus value, right? Each unit is cheaper, so you have to sell more to get to the same mass of outcome. The entry of more, cheaper products into the market generally assumes a market expansion. But with labor-saving mechanization in play, more people are surplus and less have earnings to buy the goods. The history of capitalism, therefore, on the one hand, is the history of the cheapening of labor, and on the other, the struggle for markets. Generally, the acquisition of new markets is the safety valve that reduces the pressure by leading to new profits and new capital agglomerations in industries that increasingly saturate the production of commodities. And these new markets have been major entries, and China is one of those. The entry into the former Soviet Union countries is another. And each of these processes, you can see, are actually world historic. This analysis begins by evaluating foreign direct investment, a measure of capital transfer between countries, when this funding becomes basically, and foreign direct investment is when funding becomes basically a controlling share where it's invested. Generally, approximately 20% or more of the operating capital in a particular production enterprise. Foreign direct investment is money tasked to be capital, rather than transferred for other reasons, such as direct consumption or export goods. This record is provided by the political and institutional arrangements of the IMF and the World Bank. For an analysis of centralization of capital, the stocks of foreign direct investment, or FDI, claimed by a country's nationals and the extent of annual outflow serves simply to identify the dominant or rising capitals, which we must expect to be characterized as core or semi-peripheral countries. I had initially intended to go through some of the basics of world systems theory, a description of a core country, which is basically one that produces with high capitalization and has a distribution across all sectors of society of its production. It's neither, it's not a raw goods producing entity. And then the periphery, which in fact is a country that produces primarily raw goods. And then the interesting place in between, the semi-periphery. So I've been looking at the semi-periphery primarily, which has some core-like features, some high capitalization in its production, but also some peripheral type features, such as maybe not as strong a state. A strong state, a unified society, and high technology production in agriculture and in industry, and a controlling position in the world in terms of services, that would be a core country. So let's see. So I'll go straight to table 1, which now I'm just going to describe what's shown. In Table 1, I display the 20 countries with the highest foreign direct investment and their world system status as core or semi-periphery. The United States, with a 5-year average of $346 billion of foreign direct investment, is by far the first country in the list, $346 billion annually. Second is the Netherlands, with a foreign direct investment of $258 billion. And it's arguably, which is interesting, small country, but early into the system. The earlier you get there, the more your results compound. That's followed in third place by Japan, which is also a relatively early arrival. But what's most interesting is that the fourth position in terms of the amount of foreign direct investment that's being invested annually is China, with an annual investment of $130 billion in foreign direct investment. So this is additional foreign direct investment. It's what's being put out in addition to what's being held. So essentially the top 4 positions are held by the United States, the Netherlands, Japan, and China. So this is interesting, but even more telling is the fact that when we look at the stocks of foreign direct investment, we're looking at the accumulation of these investments over time. So it's even more likely to show a great inequality. If we look at foreign direct investment stocks for 2017, we again have the United States in first place with $7.7 trillion in foreign direct investment stocks, 7.7. The Netherlands follows far behind at 1.6 trillion. And thereafter, we have about 7 countries that are in the 1-point-something trillion. Germany, Great Britain, and China. China's at $1.47 trillion of direct foreign investment accumulated. So it is not that far behind the Netherlands at 1.6 trillion, China at 1.4 trillion in 2017. And these are stocks. So the Netherlands, as I might have mentioned, has been collecting their money collecting their capital since they let the hegemony move to England, and then from England to the United States. So maybe 1750 is a continuous accumulation of foreign direct investment for the Netherlands. On the other hand, when does China start? I'm not sure. But certainly after the revolution, maybe after 1970, and it is already in position number 5. So, in contrast to earlier world systems listings, we find that one other thing I looked at was the classification of countries by their world system position. And basically, the end results have been that the core countries do come across most strongly with the world systems listing. Let's see if I can find mine. And there's also a greater shuffling, I guess. Okay. The world system status, and I also look at the International Monetary Fund percent of votes by country. So, the world system status has shifted quite a bit for a couple of countries. I should mention that, and then maybe I can kind of let that go. In particular, China, Brazil. In 1980, Brazil was 17th in the listing of top top core to periphery countries. It was a semi-periphery, but it was listed 17 out of 188 countries. China was 27th in 1980, and India was 30th in 1980. But that has changed significantly as of today. So we see that countries that had been far down in world systems and analysis of strength have now definitely moved much further to the top. Now, let me speak a little bit about this listing that I have now. Okay, so what I'm doing here is that so we looked at foreign direct investment. What I would like to look at now is the percent of votes that a country holds in the International Monetary Fund. You know, the IMF, of course, is not a democratic institution. It's based on the power you have within the international market. And the inequality is so great that many of the third world countries always complain about it. The United States has, of the votes which are based on their economic standing, the United States holds 16.52 votes. Thereafter, we have Japan at 6 votes, 6.15 votes, and China at 6.09 votes. So China falls in the 3rd place now, crowding Japan with 6 votes. Thereafter, we can run through France at 4, Germany at 5.32, France at 4, United Kingdom at 4, Italy at 3, India at 2.64. So India is currently, in terms of the International Monetary Fund, in 8th place. And this is, in my mind, quite a revolutionary change in terms of the standing of semi-peripheral countries that have been developing, if I use that word, rapidly. Nigeria is the first African country to appear, and it has half a vote. And it's at position 35 out of 188. So many countries don't even have 10%. There's some that have 0.03% of a vote. So it's quite an unequal setup, but it's also quite impressive how it has changed in terms of the entry of China and India and other semi-peripheral countries into the ranking. Another thing so I'm going to focus a little bit in on China because it's what really caught my attention. Yeah. For the first time in 2016, the Chinese currency, the renminbi, excuse my pronunciation, was added to the currencies used to create the International Monetary Fund's global currency, the globally convertible special drawing rights. To mark the launch of the new special drawing right basket, or mix of currencies that define its values, the managing director, Ms. Lagarde, stated, "The expansion of the standard drawing right basket is an important and historic milestone for the standard drawing rights, the fund, China, and the international monetary system. It is a significant change in the fund, for the fund, because it is the first time since the adoption of the euro that a currency is added to the basket. There are now 5 currencies that are used to establish the exchange rates around the world: the dollar, the yen, the euro, the pound, and now the renminbi." We can also take a look at a newer measure of the level of incorporation of individuals into the capitalist system, into the capitalist economy. So on the one hand, I'm establishing that when we look at world capital, we see that there's a shift in who's controlling it. On the other hand, I want to establish that more and more areas of the world are being drawn in. So, which is my initial goal. So we'll take a quick look at the level of incorporation of individuals into the level of incorporation of individuals into the capitalist economy by considering the IMF's survey called Financial Access Survey, FAS. FAS data is drawn from central banks and financial regulators in the country. It gives us two measures that I think are relevant. One is the number of ATM machines per 1,000 persons. And the other one is the newly emerging mobile money accounts, registered again per 1,000 people. So I have two charts in relationship to this. And first I'll just report it in terms of world systems positions. So core countries between 2008 and 2016 registered 101 ATMs per 1,000 people in their country. And then it went up to 103 ATMs per 1,000 people. So essentially between 2008 and 2016, it was flat in terms of percent change. But semi-peripheral countries register 54 ATMs per 1,000 people and 71 per 1,000 people in 2016, which is a 31% increase. So they are essentially pretty rapidly increasing in that arena. And then peripheral countries register a 58% increase over that period of 8 years, from 16 ATMs per person to 26 ATMs per person. When we look at the regions, I find that East Asia has Africa has the most rapid growth coming from a small base. And Southwest Asia also has a very rapid growth coming from a small base. But I think let me just keep reading to you. The most unincorporated area, okay, let me move on then from ATMs. What I want to establish with ATMs is that in core countries, there are approximately 100 of them per every 1,000 people. In the semi-periphery, there are approximately 54, so let's say there are, or 71. Approximately 71 per 1,000 people, and in periphery countries, 26 per 1,000 people. So to go from 26 to 100 would mean, theoretically, that now your population is using the financial system and storing their wealth where centralization can take it in. Right? So we could say that 25% of the people, the rate at which people are accessing the financial system and storing their wealth in a peripheral country is 25% of how it's being done in a core country, with the semi-periphery at about 75% of the number of people who actually are using these storage facilities. I wanted to also take a look at this innovation of using mobile phones to do one's bank accounting. It's an interesting step in the dematerialization of money and seemingly a technological leapfrog for banking, which Africa has been theorized likely to carry out in many arenas. The financial incorporation of people in African countries registers a rapid penetration with the entry of cell phones as mobile money access points. In the two tables that I present, we can see this rapid growth. The use of mobile cell phones began in Kenya, it followed in Tanzania and West Africa. This form of penetration is now deepening in Africa, rapidly in the countries where it is in use, with a 185% rate of increase between 2012 and 2016, with some increases also in terms of the number of countries. It's not that widespread, but it is growing rapidly and it is spreading. In 2012, 21 African countries registered 206 mobile phone access points per 1,000 people. This is in comparison to 0 usage reported in core countries. By 2016, that density, 206, had increased to 588 access points per 1,000 people in 25 countries in Africa. So the increase in density was even more rapid in the few other regions where we find the use of these mobile phone accounts, ranging from 253% to a 446% increase over the 4-year period. So by far, Africa has the largest number of these types of systems, 25 in Africa. In East Asia, we find 8. In Southwest Asia, we find 5 countries with them. Europe, 2. Latin America has 5 countries using the system. And North America, too good for it, 0. But I also suspect that a lot of this has to do with the financial regimes which are in place, regimens or whatever that are in place. Okay, I want to return to the question of China, and I hope I have 10 minutes to talk about it.
We have time to talk about China, which is the core aspect of your speech, and we will have 10-15 minutes for discussion. Okay? That's so important to understand whether or not China are jumping to this centralized capital system that please listen carefully now. Cynthia, continue.
So, looking at the data, I calculate that if I look specifically at the change in ATMs for China, it appears that within 1 to 3 years, China would reach an ATM concentration of 100 per person. And that depends, it's 1 year if I use a linear projection, but it's, I'm sorry, if I use a linear projection, it's 3 years. If I use an exponential projection, it's within 1 year. So the saturation of access points within China should, I think my data is 2016, so it should be any time now. It'd be interesting to see what the exact data is for 2018 or 2019. So China is arriving rapidly at this comparable density of access points. When I look at other countries, I get a rate of something like 10 years to reach, in most of the peripheral countries, to reach a saturation point with these access into the financial system. So, to focus on China specifically, the puzzle exposed in the pattern of findings is the world historic emergence of a true bifurcation in the pattern of relationships within the world system. As the Chinese center, with its logic of relationships or nexus of world systems processes, emerges increasingly successful in competition with the European hegemony in the spiral of capitalism. The European hegemony, which lasted for approximately 300 years, appears to be being overcome, and that China is becoming the dominant logic. Conditions for the freeing of African culture and civilization are now being revolutionized. I speak as an Nkrumahist, I'm always thinking about Africa, are now being revolutionized by the displacement of the racist cultural hegemony of Europe and its global settler colonialism with the rise of China. Assessment begins with several objective factors. First, Chinese capital is not the product of slavery. It is the product of socialism. This is a fundamentally different foundation for concentration of wealth, even if the wealth is being used in the capitalist global market under capitalist principles today. It was not stolen through slavery. Second, China did not invade and occupy other people's lands as settler colonialists, as did the Europeans. There were some border and expansion issues, to be sure, but long-distance mass genocide and settler colonialism, no. Third, China is reaching a point of hegemony without predatory militarism as well. These are the 3 hallmark features which gave the Europeans their lead in accumulating capital and wealth. around which the principles that animate their social structure were formed. But even their tremendous theft of life, land, and resources cannot shield them from being overtaken by a mass, united, socialist system of political economy. China is arriving by a fundamentally different path to a position of hegemony of the world economy. It is a socialist path, and that is already halfway there for Marxist theory. On the other hand, no particular territory or people can be adjudged socialist simply from afar, and most observers have withdrawn this designation from China. But in this case, I would argue there needs to be a nuanced assessment because there are multiple factors which shape the qualitative reality of Chinese control over capital and decision-making. Whether socialism is the leading, contending, or just one orientation within the central coalition in China, it is there. It is a factor. Try to wrap. Again, that makes China's pending dominance and possibility of ascendance to hegemony arguably an essentially revolutionary difference. And I guess I will, in order to conclude, I will simply say that one comment about this is that China accepts most of the forms of the international system, but not necessarily our preferred norms. That there's a disconnect between the forms and the norms means that Beijing's revisionism and demands for change often plays out now within the existing international framework. This was noted in the in Foreign Affairs magazine. And I would also like to suggest that we are now in a period of struggle over norms. So, finally, alternatively, the argument that China is now capitalist could also be supported by Marxist theory of centralization, as we are observing, which may be resolved in a synthesis. So, I would just like to say a quick word about chaos theory. We have a couple of models here for China's rise. One is that it's a bifurcation, it's a contending hegemon. Two is that it's leading to some kind of a synthesis between its mixture of socialist government and the existing capitalist system. Three, which it may be therefore changing the system from within, or the struggle may burst upon us, those of us who can't see within, any day. The third possibility is chaos theory, which simply says that at any given time you have a hegemonic core system. There are always peripheral isolates which are just out there doing their thing. But at the time when the central system goes into crisis, then any one of the hundreds of other options may become the workable option, in which case it rises rapidly into view, and it also becomes rapidly generalized and reproduced. So that's another scenario for the end game. And I think with that, I will leave it to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And we have 10-15 minutes for asking questions. Keep short always, if you don't mind. And no, I'll start with Magna Desai. You'll get the microphone. Oh, you are here. Start. Okay. No, it's excellent. That part is crucial. That's very good. That page, was. Thank you so much for keeping it.
Thank you for that. I remember when you say Nkrumah, of whom you have not yet spoken, I remember Nkrumah writing a pamphlet in the 1960s about what you get next from after Lenin's thing on imperialism. Was that your perspective? Was that the perspective you're going to develop regarding China's rise? Because that would be against what he was saying.
Regarding Nkrumah is known for his theory of neocolonialism. He argued that if Africa did not unite and become capable of defending itself within the world as a large and strong force, it would suffer all of the things we see today. So you say that his theory contradicts what I'm saying?
I thought that he was having a post-Lenin theory of how imperialism is going to develop. That's what I remember vaguely. Is China's rise in accord with what he was predicting, or is it in contradiction to what he was predicting?
I would argue that it's in accord. First of all, Nkrumah always argued in favor of scientific socialism, even though we were very friendly with Nyerere in Tanzania, who suggested that Africa could move from the communal stage and straight into the communist stage. Nkrumah did advocate industrialization, so I would say that it's not at all conflictual. And the path to socialism is not necessarily envisioned from an Africentric point of view, as necessarily an immediate clash with the state and an overthrow of the state. Yeah, we have some other options that may occur.
That's good. One question here, please. Patna?
Yeah. Thank you.
And other question there? Ask for the microphone, please. And parity would be very good, no? We have only men this morning. Please, ladies, wake up and take also the floor. Thank you.
I like the initiative to bring centralization of capital to the debate and discourse at this conference, because we've not had that very much. And I really like much of your analysis. But I have
Bring closer.
Is it better now?
Yeah, like an ice cream, I repeat. Lick the ice cream. Okay.
Wonderful chair.
Yeah.
I have some comments in order to, which suggest ways of refining this analysis. Let me say them briefly. One is that you look at the cumulative stocks of FDI as a measure of centralization, and up to a point, I think that tallies with Marx's ideas. However, if you look at the process of centralization, for example, with financialization and securitization of land, you have various organizations which not only centralize or merge capital, but also break down existing agri-businesses, existing companies in order to gain controlling shares. So what in practice we have in centralization processes is a combination of centralization and fragmentation or decentralization. So in that sense, it's a restructuring process, which I think has become much more obvious with...
Yeah, microphone would be better to conclude.
Sorry,
your question.
is this better now? Okay. Okay. So my first point is that if one can kind of extend Marx's concept to include not just merger and centralization of capital, but also fragmentation and restructuring. My second comment is about your...
On the microphone.
My second comment is about the potential for centralization that you try to bring out through the indices on ATMs and other access points. Now, the point to be made here is that the access points and other measures of that kind give an idea of the potential for centralization. In other words, number of individual agencies and individual capitals which could be brought into processes of centralization. They don't actually deal with centralization as such. And I thought that distinction might be useful. Mm-hmm. My third point is about China, which you kind of bring out that it's not a colonial settler capitalism based on slavery and so on. And all of that is correct, and I agree with that. However, I think we need to be a little more nuanced about China because there are other problems with China. For example, China has also had domination of certain groups within China's borders, the Uyghurs, Tibet, which was annexed. And so...
More on the microphone, please.
Yeah. I think that if we can think of the Chinese path as a separate path, but a separate path which is not entirely ideal or glorious all the way, that there are also problematic aspects, I think that would be a more nuanced way of looking at it. And my last point is that centralization of capital, as you point out, can also apply to socialist economies. David Harvey, in his analysis, tries to do that, but he confuses or conflates accumulation by dispossession with centralization of capital. But the evidence from post-transition countries suggests that these processes are at work. Thank you.
Okay, Cynthia, can you reply? And we'll take last question. Only men. You know, it's terrible. We have this principle, we never follow that principle. Here we 50-50, no? Okay, so maybe the last one will be there. Please, Cynthia. I just show some tables on the screen so that you can check some statistical figures, but the tables are small, sorry, so they will be available on the internet, as I say.
So it is true that access points is not the same thing as the centralization of capital, but I did feel that it was an indicator of people. It's an indicator of the breakdown of communal and other forms of production, small-scale production in societies where people tend to not put their money in banks. So in that way, yeah. So it's only an indicator. And yes, I think this study could go deeper and further to look at some of the centralizations, but even something like land, it's reflected within the financial system. So I probably want to stay on the level of financial accumulation. As to China and in the domestic groups which have had oppression within China, there's no perfect land anywhere. I'm never thinking, oh, I'm going to find the place where there's no conflicts between people. The scale of the exploitation and domination and predatory behavior that occurred over 200 years of time or more in slavery, in land dispossession, it just simply is not in the same realm of an internal struggle today. So I still have to hold that that China will have its contradictions within its own culture. There are positives and negatives in every culture. However, the central organizing principles of Chinese society did not have to build themselves around a behavior which is an anti-human behavior. Even today, all the values that we attempt to claim in the Western world are all with the acceptance of extreme contradiction in terms of what is a humane behavior. So that's a problem. They're hypocritical in a way that I think has been really a problem for the world. And yes, communist societies also centralize capital. Essentially, my position is that you only have two paths to industrial, not even industrial development, but to technological development. You have to centralize capital. You have two paths to that. One was the European path. You steal it. The other is the communist path. Everybody in society, from everybody into society, some portion is taken. It's not always a perfect picture. People suffer under that taking, but the ability to transform the society from a society with no options to a society with options, that was done under communism.
Okay. Last question. Short, please.
Yes. Too quick.
Very, very short, and then please give the microphone to that.
Probably the most ambitious effort in Chinese economic history to concentrate and centralize capital, especially in a short period of time, was the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s and early 60s, which resulted in the death of between 35 and 40 million people. So I wonder how you can justify your position on China given that situation. Secondly, more briefly, many people in China, in Africa, has pointed out that there are also predatory elements. The Chinese investment in Africa, very often they bring over tens of thousands of workers from China, living in isolated communities, segregated from the African population, not employing African domestic laborers in many situations. The money goes directly back to China. So I wonder, what are these contradictions within Chinese predatory policies in Africa that may explain, while many people, for instance, in the left wing of the ANC in South Africa, have been calling this Chinese neo-imperialism?
It's an excellent question. And last, Barbara Harris-White, at least we'll get 1 to 3. It's not so bad.
Okay. I'll help the ratio. Thank you very much for an interesting start of a conversation about decentralization. I wonder whether for the audience you could define the difference between concentration and decentralization. And sitting here, not as an expert on finance capital, one of the ways in which people are incorporated into the global system is not through decentralization, concentration per se, but commodification. So you're looking at the absorption of people into the world of finance capital. But another way of looking at it is all over the world, the invasion of the domestic sphere, the invasion of the commons, the commodification of the state and policy that I was talking about yesterday, even the commodification of the air. So there are other ways of looking at centralization, concentration, through the process of commodification.
Okay.
Very good. That it's really a Marxist question, because you remember Marx's work on whether or not the economic cycle started with the goods, then go to money, and then back to goods, or whether it is money first, or capital, then commodities, and then money. So, Cynthia?
Okay, let me begin with the first comments. The great leap forward in the suffering of the Chinese people. I'm not necessarily in favor of the policies that China chose internally, and I'm never in a position to make a decisive choice in those types of things. And there's always the counterfactual. So there's the assumption that this should have been done differently and would have resulted in a better situation for the people internally. I have no disagreement with that. But on the other hand, when I talk about socialism or communism, I can just take Cuba as an example. I could take the Soviet Union, how it went from a backward country to a contender against the United States from 1917 to 1945. So in 30 years or so, it managed to move itself from, quote, basket case to contender. So I'm not saying that it's a perfect process or that I agree with the way in which things were done internally. I'm only observing the fact that societies have made the choice. And what I see is that the following the path of the market economy is not going to take you into, you're not going to beat the system or rise up in the system well by simply following the system. Because when you look at how the countries who are in the lead got there, they didn't get there by fair trading. That is to say, they use militarism, or they use unfair labor situations, or they used theft of land. That's pretty much the case for the early arrivals. Japan is maybe a little bit of question in that. It's situation in Africa. I don't know, my position is that Africa's grown up. Everybody's grown. So if you let the Chinese come in and work on the projects and set up their housing in the way that they do and compete for a contract in your country, that's a question of how you organize your country. And I think that's a question of political consciousness. Because if you're politically conscious, you'll know that when you invite someone in to do some development in your country, you have to make sure you set the conditions such that your people develop the human capital for that. The Chinese have done some very irritating things on the continent, but my position is that the vast majority is the choice, is the bad choice making on the part of African governments, and those governments are way too wed to the free market economics, which just says, with the idea that you just let somebody come in who has the cheapest price and can bring the most capital, and then let them do it anyway. So I don't really hold that against the Chinese. Again, I would like them to do differently, but I think that we could maybe make them do differently. And then I hadn't said deconcentration. I was really saying concentration. But so concentration and centralization. Concentration is according to Marx, is the thorough permutation of a particular economic arena, the thorough penetration of a particular area with capital. So, for instance, we used to take care of our senior citizens at home, but gradually we got the elder care places, and we got people to pay to come in and take care of them. This is what I would consider commodification of the care of our senior generation. To the extent that that 10% of us use it versus 50% of us use the senior homes, that's a question of concentration. How concentrated is the commodification in a particular sector? So I'm not a fan of commodification by any stretch of the imagination. I am talking about its coming, and frankly, I could cry, because I spend much of my time in indigenous communities in Ghana, Burkina Faso, and some other areas of Africa. And I love the ethical culture around which they're structured and believe in its possibilities for future development. But at the same time, I've watched the commodification of all aspects of life hurrying in around me. So I also, unfortunately, I think Marx is right. This is how we're all going to go before we actually put in place a better system.
Do you mind if we stop this there, and we have tea and lunch for interaction, and continue the discussion with Cynthia? Thank you so much, and I draw really your attention, because I'm myself traveling a lot in the world, and I can see that China is really today a game changer, you say in English, isn't it? Is a game changer on many, many issues, and whether or not the Marxist software can help to understand what is the next chaotic change of the world economy, or the more smooth, I don't know exactly, but it's really a question addressed to Marxists, whether or not it's an intellectual model, it's a theoretical background, can help us to understand the impact of the Chinese challenge. It's really the challenge of today, not yesterday or of tomorrow. It's the today challenge, and what happened in the US with Donald Trump show exactly that the process is now going very, very fast, and my speech, not mine, but the speech of my friend from Africa will be a testimony of that. That speech was presented in Beijing last month, where the Chinese authority invited 5,000 scholarships from all over the world for a conference on Marx. Can you imagine? 5,000 scholars. And they were invited for 1 week. They met with Xi Jinping, etc., etc. It's amazing how these delegates were selected from developing countries, not almost a single from the Western world. And how they came back from Beijing with a different mindset, so that I had to spend 1 hour with my friend from Senegal to tell him that, take care, don't embrace too fast the Beijing consensus model. Anyway, Cynthia, again, thanks a lot, and please, I recommend you the reading of its paper, and please make sure, Shebal, that the paper is available very quickly, especially because the tables are interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boillot, and thank you, Professor Hewitt. I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the memento.
And you show this, and you stay with us. Please take it in the middle. No, I have to be in the middle because I'm the man. Thank you, Cynthia.